In today's lecture, we look at the politics of everyday health and ableism. Here is the overview for the lecture. Firstly, how do illness and disability get defined? What do we mean by this, and what are the differences between illness, sickness, and disability? Secondly, what is meant by the sick role, and how does society construct certain people as sick? Thirdly, we'll be considering what's being termed the medical model for thinking about illness and disability, and thinking in the context of that about what is constituted as normal and what has been thought of as abnormal, and how the categories of normal and abnormal play into the definition of some people as sick or disabled. As an alternative to the medical model, we'll be considering the proposal that a social model to the discussion of illness, disability, and sickness might be a better proposal. We'll then be thinking about the concept of stigma and how associating certain people with abnormality has an impact on their ability to be part of society. Okay, so firstly thinking about how we define illness and disability. According to Turner from an article in 1995, we should distinguish between disease, which he calls a physical pathology, illness, which is the experience of discomfort associated with having a disease, and sickness, which is the social consequences of being ill. So firstly, what is sickness? The most simple definition of health is the absence of disease. So if you're healthy, you don't have any kind of disease. Sickness, on the other hand, is slightly different. Sickness interferes with everyday routines. It is generally defined by individuals in relation to their own perceived norms. So you might say something like, I never get the flu. This is really unusual. Why am I sick? This is not normal for me. So we already think of sickness in relation to how we consider normality. Generally, when we get sick, we expect to be sick for a certain period of time and then to get better. And also we're allowed to be sick. So for example, you all know that you need to get a doctor's certificate if you've had to take time off and are unable to attend uni or work. But if we are sick for too long a time, we might be suspected of taking advantage of the system. So missing 1 or 2 tutorials is fine, but missing 5 or 6 is considered to be beyond the pale. You might also be doubted as to whether or not you really are sick because, as I said before, sickness is associated with a relative period of time which then is overcome. And this is the boundary between what we think of as sickness and what is thought of as chronic illness. According to Susie Scott, if being sick is defined by this circumscribed period of time, those with a chronic illness are people whose disease affects them long term, sometimes from onset until the end of their lives. People often experience their illness in relation to how they are viewed by society. So the illness tends to take on a social significance beyond the symptoms themselves. So for example, sufferers often need to learn to cope with managing the signs of the disease that may be perceived as socially embarrassing for themselves and for others. Family members, colleagues, and friends may also need to adjust their behavior or their habits due to the individual's disease. This could happen in relation to diet. So for example, if a family member is on a low sodium diet, it might be more convenient for the entire family to adjust. Or for example, you might have a chemical intolerance, making it difficult for you to be in a place where people wear perfume. So people in your workplace might have to be asked to adapt to that. People interviewed by researchers talk about experiencing their illness as what they call, or what Susie Scott calls, a biographical disruption. In other words, this is an interruption to your life course. Your life course changes and everything becomes affected by having an illness. So people need to develop narratives or stories that explain their illness and their new life conditions, not only to others, but also to themselves. They have to make sense of those conditions. This helps them to make sense also of the impact that the illness has had on their lives. So, for example, people might talk about appreciating the little things in life or living life one day at a time. These can be thought of as coping strategies. As we shall see later when we ask what is normal in relation to health and disabilities, these narratives serve to return a sense of social order to the individual. As Susie Scott has remarked, and I quote, "Chronic illness serves as another reminder of a central paradox in life, that wherever we find breaches of the norm, we find responses that attempt to restore social order." People with chronic illnesses are often seen as deviants by society. This is especially the case if their illness is not an obvious one. And this has been reported by many people who have a condition that is not immediately obvious to people, and they are often judged on the basis of that condition. The third term here is impairment. It's a sociological term that means the physical reality of bodily damage, dysfunction, or abnormality, according to Susie Scott. And this can be compared with disability, which can be defined as the limitations caused by the impairment to a person's functional ability. Handicap is also used to mean the social disadvantages that result from disability, but because handicap has taken on pejorative meanings, we now tend to use it less. For example, one example that Susie Scott talks about is the disease cystic fibrosis, which is an inflammation of the lungs. This is the impairment, the cystic fibrosis. This leads people to have difficulties in breathing, mobility, and tiredness. That effect is what we call the disability. And the further effect of that is making people unable to work long hours, which is the handicap. So this is the way these three terms define the effects. The definition of disability is related to the social perception of a condition as being disabling. Scott compares, for example, being short-sighted or wearing glasses, which is an impairment which carries very little social stigma, to, for example, alopecia or total hair loss, which may lead to a person being teased, bullied, and so on. In other words, the disability is often in the eye of the beholder. Even someone in a wheelchair might not regard themselves as disabled. So disability is also associated with not only with identity, but also with labeling. We're going to look at this idea further when we discuss the question of the normal and the abnormal as largely a matter of social convention, and the notion of stigma, or how certain conditions are perceived as undesirable, leading to people being discriminated against as a result of their disability. So, like in everything in this course, we're interested in the social effects of health and illness and the perception of certain conditions on people's ability to be in the world, to be in society. As Kleinman et al. Have observed, if doctors wish to treat people in a multicultural society, they need to understand and appreciate why it is that many people seem to respond more to so-called popular or folk treatments. These are things like self-treatment, so home remedies, family care, self-help groups, religious practitioners, heterodox healers, and so on and so forth, than to mainstream medicine or what the literature calls biomedicine. They don't think that means that mainstream medicine should be abandoned, but, according to Kleinman et al., that doctors should be less ethnocentric when it comes to these so-called lay approaches to sickness and healing. According to Chrisman, there are four main ways in which people around the world explain illness. Firstly, what he calls logics of degeneration, so the body is seen as aging or run down. Secondly, in terms of mechanics, so the body is seen as in terms of its parts which are in need of repair, much like a car which needs a part replacing. Thirdly, there is talk of invasion, so we think about germs and viruses invading the body. And a fourth way of thinking about illness is in terms of balance, and this can be seen very much in the Chinese concept of yin and yang, which, according to Chinese medicine, have to be balanced for perfect health. Many cultures believe in the need for protection from the evil eye in order to save people from being struck down by disease. And other cultures see particular areas of the body as the key to good general health. So, for example, the French will talk about crise de foie, which means liver crisis. There may not be anything scientifically provable about these beliefs from a Western medical perspective, but they might just as well be ways to protect one from ill health. So, for example, taking the French case, if believing that the liver is a key to good health might lead a person to eating and drinking in moderation, this would obviously lead to general good or better health than one already has. According to sociologists who work in the field of health, illness, and disability, we need to think about becoming sick as a social process that is determined by things like culture, as we've just seen, by class, but also by the expectations of society. And it's important to realize that these expectations can also change over time. According to Talcott Parsons, back in 1951, we can talk about something called the sick role to describe attitude to illness in the West. Parsons explains that being sick is set up in relation to being well, which is seen as the normal state. Being sick is permitted as long as we take steps to becoming well. So, for example, we need to go and see the doctor, and we need to comply with the treatment that the doctor gives us. He also explains that we need to understand this in Western societies in the context of capitalism. People are only seen as useful members of society if they are able to work. Changes to the incapacity benefit scheme in the UK over the last few years is a good illustration of this. Those changes have meant that many people with chronic illnesses have now been deemed fit for work and, as a result, no longer receive incapacity benefit that they were being paid while they were absent from work. This is supposed to be in order to cut down on people who are called benefits cheats, or what we might call bludgers. In other words, people who are seen as not wishing to help themselves to get better and are a drain on the system by taking welfare payments instead of getting up and going out to work. But in many cases, people with recognizable chronic illnesses that make it difficult, if not impossible for them to work, have been denied benefits. One of the famous cases of this, which was actually documented in a BBC documentary a few years ago, was of a man called Stephen Hill, who died of a heart attack 39 days after he was declared fit to work by a government contractor and subsequently denied sickness benefits by the Department for Work and Pensions in the UK. Now, to avoid becoming officially sick, people might engage in a variety of strategies. So they might avoid seeking medical help. This is particularly true for men. And when sickness starts to encroach on our lives, especially in terms of the ability to work, people start to identify as sick and seek help. And in general, there is a strong impetus to avoid the sick role. Once people visit the doctor, they then become officially sick. So their illness is labeled by receiving a diagnosis. The individual, therefore, is formally allowed to take on the sick role. They are allowed to become sick. The doctor-patient relationship is very much defined by a power imbalance, which can increase due to factors such as a person's class, age, racial or ethnic background, level of education, whether or not they speak English, and so on. Doctors are thought of as experts, and individuals are treated as lacking knowledge of their condition. So they come into the doctor's office completely ignorant of what their symptoms are and what kind of treatment they need. However, this was not always the case. Because of what we think of as lay or folk knowledge, which has now been more or less discredited, especially in Western societies. The internet has also led to a lot of self-diagnosis and arguably to more power in the hands of the patient, although of course this is not usually perceived positively by medical practitioners. On the other hand, there are many anecdotal stories about doctors telling patients to Google their symptoms. In general, the sick role is largely determined by social processes and is what we call performative. In other words, both patients and doctors have a role to play, they play a part. Doctors also have props, so they have, for example, the medical certificates that hang up in their office, they have stethoscopes and so on. And patients often perform a script that is expected of them. Diagnosis gives them the legitimacy to perform this role, the sick role. Now, there have been criticisms of the idea of the sick role because the sick role assumes that patients will no longer be sick after they receive a cure. However, as we've seen, chronic illness defies this model. The role may become permanent and then may no longer be a role because it can no longer be switched off. In other words, it then becomes synonymous with a person's life. Let's talk now about the medical model of health, illness and disability. This has also been referred to as biomedicine, and it refers to the type of medicine that's generally practiced by mainstream medical doctors and hospitals in the West. It is the dominant model of medicine originating in the West, although it may coexist also with other non-biological forms in non-Western contexts. So, for example, in India, you'll find Ayurveda coexisting with biomedical forms of treatment, and in China you'll have Chinese traditional medicine coexisting. According to Susie Scott, the medical model is a discourse, a powerful structure of ideas, values and representations which shape individuals' perception of illness. There are a couple of elements to this. The first is mind-body dualism, which we already spoke about when we spoke about the body. Here, according, just to recall, the Cartesian view of the mind and body being separate is at the core of this dualism. So the mind and body are two separate entities. The body is treated as an organic entity, and the patient's feelings or emotions, so in other words, the mental processes that they're having about being sick, are generally ignored and not seen as connected to the reasons for their illness. So in this model, the body might be thought of as a machine in need of repair. And to carry out these repairs, we will turn to technology, so things like surgery and drugs most prominently. And these trump any psychological or spiritual means of healing, which are generally thought of as being unscientific or sometimes disregarded as nonsense. In his influential book, The Birth of the Clinic, the French philosopher Michel Foucault looked at the history of mental asylums. And this is where he came up with the concept of the medical gaze. This was hugely influential in the critique of the medical model as a means of discipline and surveillance over patients. Foucault spoke about hospitals and mental asylums, as they were called at the time, as total institutions. The sick role can be seen as an extension of this, because the patient must submit to the doctor's instructions in order to become well, and may face sanctions if she doesn't. According to Michel Foucault, the medical gaze leads to a dehumanizing separation of the patient's identity from her own body. Here, doctors are seen as the new sages or wise people, replacing those wise people of old with power to heal in pre-modern times. The human being is here reduced to the body. This is referred to as biological reductionism. The doctor's medical gaze was believed to be able to penetrate surface illusions. In other words, the doctor's diagnosis becomes the ultimate form of authority, trumping any other knowledge or wisdom, or even, importantly, the patient's own feeling about what might be wrong with her. Foucault calls doctors the new sages because their diagnosis is thought of as a near mystical discovery of hidden truth. Medicalization is the critique of the idea that the medical model is pervading more and more aspects of life. Normal occurrences in a human's life which were not treated as medical events are now treated as in need of medical attention. The most obvious example of this is pregnancy and childbirth. Having a baby at hospital instead of home is actually a very recent phenomenon of the mid-20th century, although in several countries, home births, for example, are either illegal or made very difficult. A good example of this is a film from a few years ago called The Business of Being Born, in which the US television personality Ricki Lake questions the motives of the medicalization of childbirth in the United States, where natural childbirth is becoming a more and more rare phenomenon. The film describes the abnormally high rates of cesarean sections in the US, which are generally timetabled to suit doctors' schedules rather than being in line with the baby's readiness. Leading figures in midwifery and obstetrics, such as the French advocate of natural childbirth Michel Audin, are questioning the potential dangers for the human species of over-medicalization of pregnancy and childbirth. In Hungary, Agnes Gereb, who is a midwife, was imprisoned for helping women have home births, which are illegal in that country. Okay, so I want to couch all of this background in the question of what is normal and what is considered to be deviant or abnormal in relation to health and disability. In order to start to examine why people who are sick or disabled experience discrimination, which is what we call ableism, we have to look at why we consider being ill or disabled as abnormal in the first place. This might lead us to the question, what is normal? Or perhaps, why do we even need the concept of normality? According to Leonard Davis, to understand the disabled body, we need to return to the understanding of the normal body, quote unquote. This is because the problem doesn't lie with the person with disabilities, but with the way society constructs normality, which in turn makes disability into a problem. So why would disability be considered a problem is the question that we're dealing with. So where does the idea of the norm originate? In fact, both normality and disability are new modern concepts. Again, according to Leonard Davis, the social processes of disabling arrive with industrialization. In other words, we don't think about the concept of disability before the late 18th or the early 19th century. The word normal, which means conforming to the standard type, only enters the English language in 1840. So in the grand scheme of things, historically, this is pretty late on. The idea of normality enters into usage with the birth of the science of statistics, which literally means science of the state. Statistics requires the notion of the average man or woman according to which to judge deviation or difference from the norms. We take the standard, the greatest number of people, and then everything else is judged in comparison to that standard, which is considered the norm. According to Davis, and I quote, the average man, the body of the man in the middle, becomes the exemplar of the middle way of life. The average then becomes the ideal to which everyone should strive or conform. According to Quetelet, who is the originator of the science of statistics, defections and monstrosities, this is a quote from him, disappear more and more from the body, the more deviations from the mean diminish. Now, lest we think that these are, ideas that only existed in the past and which we don't use anymore, a good example is a book called The Bell Curve, which was brought out in the mid-80s. The concept of a norm means that most people should be part of the norm. In other words, most of the population falls under the arch of the bell curve. So this is exemplified here. This is a bell curve in the picture that you're seeing on the screen. It's also known as the Gaussian density function. At the extremities, so that the points at which it tails off at the bottom, is where we see deviation from the norm. So the concept of the norm is always accompanied by the idea of deviation or extremes. So those with disabilities are thought of as deviants, as most people are considered to be in the blue region of the bell curve and to have normal bodies. The Bell Curve was also the title of a book by two US writers, Herrnstein and Murray, which, as I said, they brought out in the mid-1980s, in which they used the idea of normalcy and deviance to talk about race. And they argued that black people in the United States were naturally deviant and therefore had to be disciplined, surveilled, and punished in particular ways. This is also associated with the racial science of eugenics, which advocated for people who were racially deviant to be either bred out through sterilization or exterminated. This was at the core of the Nazi idea. And the term eugenics literally means well-born. All early statisticians, so the ones who came up with the idea of the bell curve in the early to mid-1800s, had one thing in common. They were all eugenicists. Famous eugenicists who were also statisticians include people like Francis Galton and Karl Pearson, who were major advocates in the late 19th century of racial science. The link between statistics and eugenics is the idea that a population can be made normal. So everybody can be made to be more like the region, the blue region at the center of the bell curve. The aim of eugenics is for the state to norm the non-standard. Eugenicists proposed a variety of ideas, as I said before, such as sterilizing the poor, the disabled, and the racialized, to even their extermination, which, as I said, happened under Nazism. Eugenics comes along at the same time as another very popular idea of the mid-19th century, that is Darwinism. This is the science developed by Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin's idea of the survival of the fittest was interpreted by people who followed him, who were called social Darwinists, and applied to the human species. So it's important to recognize that Charles Darwin was always only talking about the natural world. He wasn't talking about human beings, but that this was applied to human beings by people called social Darwinists. The idea at the heart of social Darwinism was that the nation was like an organism. If it were to survive, only those with the best chances of survival should be allowed to live. Anyone who was seen as placing the overall health of the nation in danger, so again the disabled, but also the poor, black people, Jews, and so on, should be let die. According to Ruth Hubbard, eugenics reached its pinnacle under the Nazis. The first people to be exterminated before Jews, which is the case that we are more familiar with, were disabled people, and especially children with Down syndrome, who were considered a danger for the purity of the nation. And this was euphemistically termed the euthanasia program, which is interesting considering that euthanasia implies voluntarism. But also it's important to recognize that Britain and the US, for example, had a strong eugenics movement too. Winston Churchill, who was of course lauded for winning the Second World War, also advocated for eugenics in Britain in the 1920s. And many racialized women, so black women and Latina women, have been sterilized against their wills in recent living memory. Until January 2013, transgender people in Sweden had to undergo sterilization if they wanted to transition. Now, Ruth Hubbard argues that although the situation is completely different today, that similar logics are at work in screening for hereditary diseases during pregnancy, that lead many parents to make the choice to abort fetuses that may be born and grow up to develop hereditary diseases. And she argues that the notion that women have choice in making such decisions is misleading. In this quote, it's worth reading it out, she says, if a mother chooses not to take the tests, so these are tests for, testing for potential future disability or chronic illnesses, or not to terminate a pregnancy despite a positive result, she accepts responsibility for whatever the disability will mean to that child and to her and the rest of her family. In that case, the family and the rest of society can reproach her for having, so to speak, caused that human being's physical pain as well as the social pain he or she experiences because our society does not look kindly upon people with disabilities. Hubbard gives the example of Huntington's disease, which is one of the diseases for which people were sterilized by the Nazis, interestingly enough. It is a hereditary disease, but people don't develop it until their 30s, 40s, or 50s, when they may have already had their own children. Also, there is no cure for the disease. However, there is now a reliable test to establish the likelihood of developing the disease if enough family members are willing to be tested for it. Ruth Hubbard argues that this then puts people with a family history of Huntington's in an outrageous position. They may be healthy and don't know whether they will get the disease. If they and their family members decide to get tested and the test reveals that the fetus has the genes for Huntington's and abortion is decided upon, they are basically saying that a life lived in the knowledge that one may eventually die of Huntington's disease, that is later in life, is a life not worth living. So you're forced into making that judgment by having this test during pregnancy. Hubbard claims that the problem is ultimately about deciding who should or who should not inhabit the world. Many people are disabled due to accidents. So, is it right, she asks, that we make the choice to terminate pregnancies that may result in disabled children? She argues that it is problematic to make judgments about which lives are worth living, and that these judgments are too similar to those made by exterminationist regimes such as the Nazi regime. Our judgment of what is a good life is governed by our focus on the achievement of normality as the ideal life. However, as many disabled activists say, it is not up to able-bodied people to determine whether or not their lives are good or worth living. Also, obviously, these are extremely difficult questions that people are confronted with, and they refer to questions of ethics, which are generally dealt with in philosophical thinking. Okay, so I want now to turn to some of the different approaches that have been suggested that try to subvert or critique the medical model and the idea of normality and abnormality. First and foremost is what has been called the social model of health, illness, and disability. In contrast to the medical model's view that the aim of treatment is to enable people to have so-called normal lives, the social model advocates that our perception of what is normal needs to shift in order to accommodate disability. The social model doesn't see disability as an individual problem, so a person's personal tragedy, but rather talks about society having to adapt to meet the needs of people with disabilities. So, while a person might have an impairment leading to her needing to use a wheelchair, she only becomes disabled according to the social model if she cannot move around with ease in her wheelchair. So, for example, if the pavement doesn't have ramps and so on. So the solution is to make the social environment more accessible by, for example, placing ramps where they're necessary. Responsibility is placed on society here rather than on the individual to change and adapt. However, as Susie Scott points out, some people critique the social model because it doesn't take into account of the fact that some people are disabled regardless of their social environment by the illness itself. And they argue that we must take into account what people say about their condition and whether or not they subjectively experience it as disabling. In other words, the disabling feeling associated with having an illness might not disappear even if the person's social needs are completely met. Nevertheless, the social model has been a cornerstone of the fight against discrimination on the grounds of disability, what we can refer to as ableism. So I want finally to talk about the notion of stigma in the work of Erving Goffman and connect it to the cost of getting better, which is a campaign that we can end with for drawing light to some of the continued questions around illness, health, and disability. So what do we refer to as stigmatizing conditions? Disability and mental health are social rather than individual problems, according to the social model. And it is this fact that leads to discrimination or abuse of people who have mental or physical disabilities. According to Erving Goffman, the notion of stigma means a discrepancy between one's virtual, that is, they're presented, and one's actual or privately experienced selves. So, difference between how you experience yourself as an individual and how you are seen in society by others. Goffman says that this results in the perception of having a so-called spoiled identity. In other words, we perceive our disability, which is our actual identity, as negative and try to keep it hidden because we associate it with a stigma, with something that is negative. This is particularly the case for people with mental health problems. Many people never admit to having had a difficulty, and it often leads these people to being unable to cope alone because of the amount of stigma in society attached to having a mental health problem. Particularly, we might want to argue for men, for people of a certain generation, and perhaps for members of certain minority groups. There is a difference in the stigma people can feel if their disability is apparent or not, but both can be stigmatizing. Susie Scott gives the example of autism, which is a growing problem affecting more and more people. Autism has often been misperceived as a form of social deviance. People, especially children, may have so-called odd behavior and be told off for breaking the rules, for being naughty, and so on. However, in reality, they may not have any control over their behavior. Gray notes that the condition is not stigmatizing for the individuals themselves, who may not even be aware that they are behaving according to the norm or not. On the other hand, often it is their families who experience what Goffman calls courtesy stigma, so that is stigma on behalf of their children, especially, for example, in situations where they may be socially embarrassed as a result of their child's behavior and have to, develop coping strategies for that. So, what is ableism? Ableism is the discrimination against people that is based on the stigma that exists according to which the disabled are unable to participate wholly in society. Activists in disability rights liken ableism to racism, sexism, and homophobia, and campaign for disabled people to have adequate access to all spheres of life, as well as to have special provisions where necessary. Now, while there is widespread agreement that racism, sexism, and homophobia constitute prejudices that disadvantage people, there is a common denial among many disabled activists that ableism is a real prejudice. Most people wouldn't admit being prejudiced against disabled people openly in the same way that they may be openly sexist, for example. So it's a kind of a hidden form of discrimination that affects disabled people, and it's been doubly difficult for disabled people to have recognition that ableism is a recognized form of discrimination. Lastly, in her critical article on the It Gets Better campaign, which is a campaign in the US against gay youth suicide, Jasbir Puar has extended the discussion of suicide among gay youth to the wider questioning of why certain lives are stigmatized. She has argued that some lives lives lived outside of the norm, so disabled lives, queer lives, trans lives, and so on, are seen as living according to a logic of slow death, which either results in suicide or de facto unhappy, troubled, or deviant existences. She says that in contrast to this, acting against stigma should not mean only trying to ensure people having access to mainstream life, so ensuring that the disabled are not discriminated against in society, but it should also mean thinking about why we think about disability as a pathology or as a something abnormal. While it is important that disability be depathologized, in other words, not seen as a debility or not seen as abnormal or wrong or deviant, in fact, for many people, especially the poor, working class, people of colour, and so on, disability is the norm. There are more and more people living with disability. So, in fact, maybe we need to shift our concept of what is normal and what is abnormal. Jasbir argues that we see disability and debility as part of everyday life. In essence, we all become incapacitated to greater or lesser degree just as a function of old age. So as we age, we become less able to participate in society as able-bodied people. Also, according to the British sociologist Nick Rose, depression will become the #1 disability in the US and the UK over the next 10 years. So we need to think about reasons why this is the case. In sum, the argument is that we should rethink the division we create socially between the abled and the disabled, which creates an ableism which divides significant portions of the population into unproductive people and productive people.